Ok, on y va. Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. Because we're offering the webinar today in English and it is offered by le Groupe des Aidants du Sud-Ouest in collaboration with la communauté de pratique en proche aidance, which is known as the CdP proche aidance. I'll be doing the presentation of the webinar, and I will also be presenting the webinar. So my name is Jerry Snittle, and I'm the general manager of le Groupe des Aidants du Sud-Ouest, a nonprofit organization that offers services to caregivers in the West Island and the Southwest region of Montreal. I will be facilitating this online talk today, and as it was advertised, my colleague Bianca Tessier was supposed to be with me today to present the project, but she could not be present, unfortunately. So I will be presenting the webinar. Before we begin and before I tell you more about the project, I would like to invite Mrs. Penchina Jean-Charles to say a few words about the importance of considering the perspective of English-speaking caregivers in Quebec.
Thank you, Jerry. Hello, everyone. My name is Penchina Jean-Charles. I'm the Provincial Caregiver Coordinator for Ethnocultural and English-speaking communities. To talk about my background, I'm a medical doctor by training, and I have a PhD in public health. So I'm based at Institut Universitaire Sherpa, which is part of CU Centre-Ouest de l'Île de Montréal, but my mandate extends across the whole province. Let me remind you that there are 27 caregiver coordinators across the regions of Quebec, including 3 for First Nations and Inuit, and 1 for ethnocultural and English-speaking communities. Today, GASO will be presenting their work for the English-speaking communities of the west part of the island of Montreal. But you should know that the realities of English-speaking communities are taken into account at the national level. So, and according to the latest statistics for 2021, English-speaking people represent between 13.88% and 14.9% of the population of Quebec. To give you some examples, under my provincial mandate, a province-wide consultation was held last year with the English-speaking and ethnocultural communities. This involved 7 workshops, 2 English language and 5 French language to document their issues and needs as caregivers. In addition, via Measure 30 of the Action Plan, which was entrusted to Institut Universitaire Sherpa, research was carried out among caregivers' experiences and from English-speaking and ethnocultural populations to in fact, both reports are published on the Institut Universitaire Sherpa website. Other projects are in progress, especially via Measure 48, which is currently co-designing in partnership with English-speaking and ethnocultural caregivers, a reference guide for a peer navigator project for English-speaking and ethnocultural caregivers. So this project is scheduled for March 2025. Finally, the Provincial Caregiver Committee for Ethnocultural and English-speaking communities has been in operation since 2022. This committee is made up of caregiver coordinators, ethnocultural and English-speaking community organizations, and healthcare professionals. So I think this committee is quite inclusive. In recognition of the committee's work in caregiving for our 2 populations, so the Ministry of Health and Social Services has initiated a consultation with the committee with a view to proposing measures for our 2 populations in the new 2026 to 2031 action plan. So I think this is good news for both populations. All this to tell you that the realities of English-speaking caregivers are being considered at the provincial level. So thanks to Jiri and his team for this project. Okay, Jiri, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ketli. So without waiting any longer, we're going to go in and jump into the content of the webinar. Just to remind everyone that the webinar is planned from 12:30 to 1:30, so we're going to try to respect that time because everybody is either on their lunch break and has to go back to work afterwards. So here we go. And we'll have we'll have a short, we'll have 15 to 20 minutes for questions at the end. So if you have questions, you can either share them in the chat or keep them for the end. We'll be able to discuss and unmute your microphones and see each other as well if you want to turn on your camera. So for the outline of the webinar, we'll be going over a short introduction of the project. I'll be presenting a portrait of informal caregiving in Quebec, an analysis of the West Island region, the methodology and the sampling used in our project, our primary findings, and some specific and detailed recommendations that are coming out from the project as it is completed. We have a conclusion, and then we have our Q&A session. By the way, I want to say hi to everybody who I see in the chat. I recognized a few names. I'm very happy to see that you're here today. So to give you a bit of insight as to how all this came into place, since 2017, our organization was offering services in English in Dorval, specifically a support group and individual services that were offered to caregivers. After several years, we realized that we were confronted with a specific challenge. We were struggling to reach English-speaking caregivers in Dorval, despite their acknowledgement, despite the acknowledgement that their needs were real and genuine, and that they were substantial. Hearing from partners and the municipality that caregivers do need support in Dorval, so we were trying our best to be able to reach them. Between 2020 and 2022, when the pandemic hit, there was a specific context that made it very difficult for us to develop English services in Dorval and in the West Island region because we were overflowed with requests for support coming from French-speaking caregivers from all of our other municipalities where we were better recognized. So people were much more in tune with the existence of our services and so on. So we didn't have any human resources available to continue expanding the services in English in Dorval and the West Island region. So this whole project, which is it really is a needs assessment project, was established to gain a deeper understanding of the challenges that were encountered by English-speaking caregivers in the West Island, and it was facilitated by a $40,000 grant from the federal government in the Community Services Recovery Fund program. And as I said before, Bianca Tessier was hired as the project manager and conducted the entire assessment and the interviews and so on. Unfortunately, Bianca could not be here today to present the project, so I will do my best to present it to you, to answer your questions if you have any specific ones. But as I was not the one who organized and coordinated everything, I was part of the committee that was supervising the project with my board of directors. It's possible that I don't have all the insights that could answer to specific questions. So I'll do my best to to satisfy any questions that I receive. So our project's objectives were divided in 4 different parts. So the first part was to comprehend the realities of English-speaking caregivers, encompassing their distinct needs and the challenges that they face. After that, we had to identify the available services in the area and evaluate their appropriateness for the needs of this population, because a very specific reason why we felt like this project was needed for Dorval and the West Island is because we did not want to create any services that already existed. So we knew that our support group in Dorval answered a specific need because there were no other support groups at that time that were available for the local population. But we were not aware if, let's say, there was already a support group that was offered in Pointe Claire or maybe Pierrefonds-Roxboro. So it was important for us to assess the needs of the territory before developing anything. Third objective was to formulate recommendations to enhance access to services and more effectively address the unique challenges faced by English-speaking caregivers. And finally, to establish prospective partnerships to enhance support networks and foster local collaborations. So the objectives were pushing us towards preparing the ground to develop services that would answer the needs, that would not step on anybody's toes if any other organization was already offering services for English-speaking caregivers, and also to facilitate the development of partnerships in the region. So who is le Groupe des Aidants du Sud-Ouest? We are known as GASO, and we were founded in 1995. We're a nonprofit community organization that is fully autonomous, and we support caregivers in enhancing their quality of life, preventing their burnout, and fostering the recognition within the community. Next year will be our 30th anniversary, and for the past approximately 10 years, we've been offering services in English and in French. And our objective is to have a fully bilingual organization within the next 3 years. So as I just said, our services are not only bilingual, but they are also complementary to whatever exists outside of our organization and in the public sector and the private sector. And we are confidential and professional. We will always put those on the highest pedestal as possible to prevent, actually to just foster confidentiality for the people who use our services. At every stage of a caregiver's process or journey, we provide emotional support and active listening, knowledge building workshops and conferences, monthly revitalizing workshops, which are non-traditional workshops such as art therapy, music therapy, and meditation. And we offer monthly support groups. So overall, every single year, we offer services to approximately 350 different caregivers in the broader Southwest region of Montreal, excuse me. And amongst those 350 people, there's approximately 40 of them that come from outside of our region. So that come from, let's say, Beaconsfield, Pierrefonds, Ville-Saint-Laurent, where there are some sectors who do not have any community services that are dedicated to caregiving. So as we know in Montreal, it's a known situation that there are some sectors that have issues in offering services equally across the Montreal territory. So to give you a few statistics without going too much into detail, because I'm assuming that most of you know these statistics and are pretty aware of the situation of caregiving in our province. According to l'Observatoire sur la proche aidance, québécois sur la proche aidance in 2022, 21.9% of the workforce in Quebec served as caregivers. Some statistics say that it's one out of 3 people who are caregivers in Quebec. So we understand that this is a very substantial number, and it requires to be able to offer these people basically 1/3 of the population specific and tailored services that answer to their needs. And this project aimed to address the disparity and enhance the support for this community, specifically for the English-speaking caregivers, because we know as of a fact that it is less likely for an English-speaking caregiver to receive adequate services in Quebec. So in the context of this project, the importance of evaluating the needs of English-speaking caregivers is underscored by demographic data, indicating that in specific regions such as Pointe-Claire, English is the mother tongue for almost 55% of the population, which was quite enlightening for us when we discovered this statistic. And it goes to show also in Lachine, where the figure stands around 24%. As an organization, we've been involved in offering services in Lachine for over 10 years, and our partners tell us that it's approximately divided between 50%, 50-50 is people in Lachine speak French, 50% speak English, and most people are bilingual. But what shows us here is that the mother tongue for some regions, such as Pointe-Claire, is a majority actually. So which really comes to clarify the need to develop specific services to support caregivers in their mother tongue. We'll speak more about this in our primary findings when where I'll be presenting how the impact of the caregiver's mother tongue has an influence on the quality of services that they receive. So as for the rest of the statistics, studies show that approximately 26% of caregivers endorse two individuals, so they take care of two different people at the same time. And 35% of caregivers do not identify with this role. So if we imagine that a third of the population is a caregiver, and a third of that population does not identify with that role, well, that leaves a lot of space to reach more people who could need services that could greatly enhance their quality of life. And one of the reasons, as it's shown here, is because it's due to the perception that caregiving is not actually a role, but it's just a family obligation. It's something that should be done and should not be stamped or identified as such. Individuals between 45 and 64 years old primarily provide care for their parents, while caregivers 65 and up primarily provide support to their spouses. So there's a difference on that point, and it's definitely something that we noticed in our project. Finally, we have a few statistics on the tasks that are done and offered by caregivers. So 71% of caregivers will offer support through transport, 51% through domestic labor, 40% through home maintenance. And in studies, there is a difference between the support that women offer versus what men offer. So women are much more, how do we say? I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the word in English, but sont plus portés. So will most likely offer emotional support, while men will most likely offer to support their loved one or the person who's being cared for with physical tasks. Caregivers dedicate in total 808 million hours annually to caregiving in Quebec, and resulting in savings of $13.7 billion for the state. Obviously, it's not a secret that for many caregivers, this role carries a substantial implication for their mental, physical, and economical well-being. So now we're going to go in the analysis of the West Island region. So as I just said previously, the native tongue has quite an impact on the access to services. So as I mentioned before, in Pointe-Claire, 55% of the population has English as their first language. And in Lachine, as an example, merely 24% do as well. However, 34.6% of residents in the West Island region speak a mother tongue that is neither French or English. So this brings us to the component of the immigrant population. A lot of people from the immigrant population in the West Island will adopt the English language to communicate publicly, socially. And for example, in DDO, Dorado des Ormeaux, or Pierrefonds-Roxborough, there is 59% of the territory's population that is from an immigration background. So this gives us a very, very specific idea of what big of a population actually is or could identify as a caregiver that speaks English or expresses themselves in English, and also comes from another background, another cultural background, with all sorts of barriers and issues to express themselves in either English or French. And another issue that came up in the project was the issue of transport in the West Island. It's pretty known that most people get by with a car in the West Island because the West Island is very large. And studies showed that almost 87% of residents primarily rely on their car, highlighting the difficulties in accessing public transportation. So these extended journeys that people have to do when they don't have a car via public transit poses a significant challenge for numerous caregivers in accessing specific services, especially if they're not close to their home. On top of all of this, according to the CIUS du Centre-Sud, which conducted an assessment on the demographics of the West Island population, the senior demographic, which constitutes 25% of the West Island population, will be of 25% in 2036, reflecting an increase of 42.4% from today. So if we take this increase into consideration, the expansion of the senior demographic and linguistic diversity signifies an escalating demand for services tailored to English-speaking caregivers who will assume an increasingly pivotal role within the Montreal context. When we learned of the statistics, this is really what gave us the green light to say we will have to think as a community, as a local community, and also as a government to find solutions that are tangible, that are realistic, to support and to work in the light of building better services for this demographic of caregivers who will necessarily need more support in the next 10 years. So I'll explain now about our methodology and our sampling process. So for the project, we divided the participant classification into 4 different categories. The objective of dividing them into 4 was to try and get a global perspective on to get an understanding, a thorough understanding of the needs of English-speaking caregivers in the West Island. So first category was caregivers themselves. Second category was psychosocial professionals. Third category was community service professionals and volunteers. And fourth was union delegates. Out of 39 organizations or institutions that were contacted, 16 replied favorably, and it gave us the possibility to interview 19 different participants. So amongst these 19, they were divided, as shown over here, between 5 caregivers, 5 psychosocial workers, 7 community workers, and 2 union representatives. Some people might ask themselves, what's the difference between our categories 2 and 3? So what's the difference between a psychosocial worker and a community worker? In this case, we included for psychosocial professionals, so clinical professionals from the public healthcare system, and the community workers were more professionals from the community organizations and volunteers who work in community organizations, and also project managers or coordinators who are responsible of projects or services that reach out to caregivers. For the data acquisition, we had an interview grid that was divided into 2 sections. So the first section was based to identify characteristics of caregivers and their role, to try and have a thorough understanding of that. And the second part was to identify the existing needs and available services. The qualitative methodology was prioritized. We really wanted to have a comprehensive insight regarding the challenges, the specific needs, and available services for English-speaking caregivers. So this type of methodology really gave us the opportunity to speak in detail about the expertise and the experience of the people who participated in the interviews. So now we are going to our primary findings. So we have 4 specific primary findings, 4 main categories that I'd like to present to you. And before I do, I just want to mention that every single detail is found within the final report of the project, which is accessible. So I will be able to send it to anyone who is interested of having it and who would like to dig more into details about the categories that I'm going to present now. So the first primary finding was that there is a general situation of delayed recognition as a caregiver. People will realize that they are a caregiver or an informal caregiver, as we say officially in Quebec, um, much later in their journey. So they might have been offering services or support to someone in their family, or taking care physically or emotionally of someone for many years before they realize, oh well, this is how this identifies. Actually, I am an informal caregiver, or I am a caregiver for my husband or my wife. So the issue with that came up in the interviews, specifically from the caregiving category. So the 5 caregivers who did the interviews really made us understand that there is a difficulty in identifying with certain terminologies that are used. So there is a linguistic stigma that is exacerbating the delayed recognition factor. And we have 2 examples here. So the first example is the term caregiver. Generally speaking, most English-speaking people will identify the word caregiver with a professional position. So people will not necessarily say, I am a caregiver for my mom or my dad or my sister, because a lot of people will use the term, for example, in a situation where they'll say, oh, well, I'm sorry, I have to cancel my participation because my caregiver did not show up to offer my respite to my loved one. So they will use this terminology to identify specific professional positions, which is not the case necessarily in French, where in French we would say un proche aidant is not a professional role, because a proche aidant identifies specifically somebody who is not paid for their services or for their work, while a caregiver in this context could mean someone who is not paid, or it could also mean someone who is paid, because people, when we look on job postings and so on, companies or agencies do recruit using the term caregiver. So the other term is loved one, and loved one pertains more to emotional and financial support. Loved one also has the love in it, so the family connotation, the close relative connotation. It doesn't apply to somebody who takes care of a friend or of a neighbor, who will not necessarily call them a loved one. So they will not necessarily recognize themselves if, for example, they see a campaign that says, do you take care of a loved one? Or do you support a loved one? Or have you been taking care of a loved one for 15 years? Well, they won't necessarily identify to that. So there's definitely a complex situation in Quebec regarding how we reach out to English-speaking caregivers with the terminology. And our project right now does not have a solution for this issue, because it is a solution. It's an issue that is complex, and it changes from one person to another. So that's one of the first primary findings. A second primary finding is that there are specific challenges for English-speaking caregivers. The first one, which is also true for French-speaking caregivers, but even more so difficult for English-speaking caregivers, is that there is a real difficulty in navigating the healthcare system. It is recognized as the primary challenge by caregivers and community professionals in our interviews. And this difficulty of navigating the healthcare system, because our healthcare system in Quebec is built around the French language, does not necessarily allow people to have access to information, to guidelines, to documentation as easily as somebody would have in French. And also it comes with an increased mental load associated with the translation. Is specifically when we're talking about a situation where English is a second or a third language. So when the person is a caregiver for their mother who speaks only Chinese, let's say, well, they have to translate from French to Chinese or from English to Chinese when their mother tongue is, for instance, Chinese. So there is definitely a difficulty at that level for certain people of immigrant backgrounds and who are English speaking to access to the information appropriately, especially in the context of the healthcare system, the public healthcare system. Then we have, like I just said, an issue with the access to services. So what we've noticed is that caregivers who have financial resources have greater access to private services in the West Island. And on the other hand, there are caregivers who live in precarious circumstances who don't have these financial resources, were frequently compelled also to reside with the individual who they are taking care of. This creates a big disparity in the West Island region. So there are communities that do not necessarily have to rely on public services, so they can get the services that they need through private English-speaking companies. And those who do not have those means will have to depend on the public sector, depending most of the time on intricate and prolonged journeys with the public service transport services. And all of that together with the fact that most people who are in precarious circumstances will be living with the person that they are taking care of, which is a perfect cocktail to create more psychosocial difficulties in the long run. So even more so pertinent to have appropriate services to help them in their situation. And finally, we have the desired services that would really help the English-speaking caregivers. That's our fourth primary finding. So the requirements for English-speaking caregivers are pretty much the same of those who are of French-speaking background. So they also need respite. They also need home care. They also need moral, psychosocial, psychological support. These are all services and realities that are very real and present. But in contrast to the French-speaking population, there is a more visible and discernible distrust of public services, and there is a preference for local community services or religious services. So there is definitely something to work on in that area, considering that there is only, like Ketley told us in the beginning, approximately 14% of the population in Quebec that is of English-speaking background. But there is something to do from all levels of government and municipalities to reach out more appropriately to English-speaking caregivers and to bridge this gap of incomprehension and distrust regarding public services. So now we're going on to our recommendations. So just to summarize what we just looked at, what we just presented, so there is a specific challenge of navigating the healthcare system, and it continues to be a significant barrier. There is a cognitive strain associated with translating and utilizing a second language restricts its efficient access to services, especially public health services. And there's distrust in public services that underscores the necessity for alternative strategies, including community organizations and private sector services. So we have three main priorities that were recognized through the projects to enhance and to increase and improve the situation for the West Island region. So the first priority would be to enhance the language accessibility. There would need to be a systematic translation of all documents and correspondence. This systematic translation could also be in other languages than just English, because there is a very strong population that is from an immigrant background. And there needs to be a clear presentation of services that is customized for English-speaking caregivers. So we could imagine public online talks such as this that present the structure and the mechanisms to access to the public healthcare system. for English-speaking caregivers, presented in English and possibly even in a third language. Then, as a second priority, is to geographically enhance the accessible assistance that is offered or the accessible services. So what we would need to do is to enhance local services to minimize lengthy commutes. So ideally, somebody who lives in Saint-Anne-de-Bellevue would not need to go to Dorval to get a service in the West Island, but they could go somewhere that is much closer to their house. And then also to enhance the involvement of the community and religious organizations in regions such as DDO, Pierrefonds, Roxborough, and Pointe-Claire, where a very strong immigrant population resides and which utilizes those community and religious services to navigate and to adapt themselves to live in Quebec. So there is definitely a potential for partnership in that on many different levels of either organizations, private, public, or both, or community. And finally, there is a need to have tailored assistance or tailored services for English-speaking caregivers. So to provide specific services that will help them to navigate the healthcare system. So for instance, one-on-one support to explain to them how they can formulate a request for support, how to formulate requests for services for their loved one, if they're having difficulties with their autonomy and so on, and to provide English support groups to exchange resources and alleviate isolation. So that was one of the main services that came back a lot, that English support groups were very, very helpful for caregivers in the West Island. So now we have more detailed information about these recommendations. So when we speak of enhancing linguistic accessibility, I spoke about systematically translating official communications and documents and to ensure the use of terminology that is appropriate to the role of the caregiver. Oh, I just noticed that there's a little problem with the translation. PPA is supposed to be of the caregiver. Secondly, to adjust the terminology, it's also useful to prevent cultural misunderstandings associated with the terms such as caregiver or family member. Like I said before, there is a context that is very specific to our bilingual society, where people will not necessarily identify as a caregiver or an informal caregiver. And the third recommendation would be to train public service personnel to extend a warm welcome and offer clear explanation to English-speaking caregivers. So in this situation, it would be to ensure that any English-speaking individual who reaches out to a public service in the West Island could be welcomed in English and to be welcomed, giving them the entire documentation and explanations in their preferred language. Second set of recommendations revolves around the development of tailored and region-specific services. So the first idea would be to have established service points in regions such as Pointe-Claire, Pierrefonds, DDO, where the English-speaking caregivers are predominantly located. In this context, I would take our organization as an example. If one day le Groupe des Aidants du Sud-Ouest is capable of managing to have a grant to develop English-speaking services in the West Island, well, one thing that is for sure is that we would need to have a service point in the West Island because we are located in LaSalle and we would definitely not be inclined to offering services to somebody in Beaconsfield if they would have to drive over to LaSalle or even worse, take public transport to come to LaSalle to get a service. The second point is to foster partnerships with places of worship and cultural organizations to engage communities that are occasionally marginalized from public services. So inevitably, I'm speaking about the immigrant population in this context, who in many occasions rely on cultural and cultural organizations and places of worship. There is a very big potential to collaborate between these specific areas of society with community organizations, for instance, to, for example, offer a place to offer a support group, offer or share an office a few times per week to offer services for the people who identify as caregivers amongst their community, and so on. The third set of recommendations revolves around enhancing the access to the healthcare system. So in this case, we have the first recommendation is to develop practical resources to assist caregivers in their initiatives, including bilingual guides or public presentations on access mechanisms. So like I said before, this could truly be beneficial if the public sector, public healthcare sector could provide talks or presentations about how to formulate requests in a CLSC, or how to access basic services, or to actually do to just open a file in a CLSC for somebody who needs support. That could be very, very helpful. That was one of the main elements that came back from caregivers in the interview process. The second point is to provide support services from trained professionals, to assist caregivers in navigating the various stages of delivering care. So in this context, we are speaking about somebody who identifies as a caregiver, who realizes that they've been on this journey for a while, and that now they would need support to put in place the appropriate measures and set of limits to not be pushed towards a burnout, or simply to be exhausted in the role. So to provide this specific tailored support for English-speaking caregivers who are already having issues accessing services in Quebec would be of great value for them. For our fourth set of recommendations, we have the additional assistance for community organizations. So in this context, we are speaking specifically of financial support for nonprofit organizations in the West Island who already offer support services, including support groups, workshops, and individual assistance. With more reaching out and more campaigns and more publicity about the services, there could definitely be more people who benefit from these services. And a second point would be to strengthen collaborations between nonprofit organizations and the public services that exist to enhance their collective effectiveness in addressing the needs of caregivers with greater coherence. And this was particularly interesting because it came out in every single interview that we did with caregivers and with psychosocial professionals and the community professionals, that there is an issue with ping-ponging people, pardon the expression, from one resource to another. So not only is it exhausting for the caregiver to have to go from one resource to another, repeat their story, ask for help once more, build the courage again to do it and to spend the energy to invest their time. But there is also a lack of efficiency coming from the professional side, because the professional will welcome the caregiver, explain the services, do a needs assessment, and then, most of the time we'll say, well, we cannot necessarily offer you what you're looking for, so call this place. So a better collaboration between community, nonprofit, and public services could greatly benefit English-speaking caregivers in the West Island. But I think that this is true for any sector in Quebec, but it's definitely something that came up in our project in the West Island. And finally, fifth recommendation was to enhance awareness and advocate for caregivers. So one idea that could benefit greatly the population is local awareness campaigns to assist English-speaking caregivers in recognizing their roles and accessing available resources. So in this case, we could think of campaigns that are specifically targeting the West Island region, that are translated into 5 or 6 different languages, that are the most prominent in the excuse me, the immigrant population in the West Island. And the second point would be to advocate for their critical role among decision makers. So let's say among municipalities, elected officials, deputies, and so on, and to ensure that they have sustainable and adequate support. So just to make sure that one of that I'm expressing myself properly, the idea is to recognize the existence of English-speaking caregivers because we do not hear so much about them in Quebec as a whole. We do talk a lot about caregiving, but we speak a lot about caregivers who are of French-speaking backgrounds. So for populations who have a very high percentage of English-speaking people of whom their mother tongue is English, these measures would be very efficient in reaching out to them in a much more efficient way. So in conclusion, the summary of our primary findings is that there are some key issues. So mainly that English-speaking caregivers in the West Island encountered distinct obstacles, including an increased language-related mental load, difficulties navigating the healthcare system, and challenges related to geographic accessibility. And that the main finding is that these challenges necessitate modifications to existing services, but we do not need to develop new structures. So we can invest in what exists already to enhance and to improve, but we do not need to create new organizations or create new services as a whole. We already have what we need. We just need to support it better in the West Island. So finally, the project emphasizes practical and flexible solutions to enhance support for English-speaking caregivers in the West Island. These recommendations provide a foundation for tangible and cooperative initiatives designed to improve the quality of life of English-speaking caregivers. So if you would like to receive the final report, like I said before, it's easily accessible. We've decided to not send it out publicly. So if you are interested in reading it, please send me an email at direction@commercialgazo.ca. And it would be my pleasure to send you the PDF file via email. And that is all for our webinar of today. Thank you very much for being here and for listening.